No, it all starts out December 28, 1924, when I was born in Rockwell, Iowa, right near Mason City, Iowa. My dad was a band director, as was both of his brothers. His younger brother was the University of Iowa band director. But I was raised in Kankakee, graduated, had a couple of scholarships at the University of Illinois. I was 17 at that time. So I went to school. The war was on by then. After a couple of semesters, I dropped out, and on July 1st, 1943, I joined the Navy. I went through the Great Lakes training. Then I auditioned and played in the band for a while. I auditioned on my trumpet. Ray Anthony and people like that, professional musicians, were in the band, but I played the baritone and sang in the group. We did this Meet Your Navy radio show. Derwin Kirby was the announcer. I was just so thrilled to be with all these people, sort of in showbiz for about 3 months. After a few months, the commander called me and said, you've qualified for the V-12 program. Where would you like to go? Now, I almost fell off the chair. Anybody in service, they never asked you where you wanted to go. They just told you where to go. I said, I'd like to go to the University of Illinois, where I went to school. Well, I did. I went into the V-12 program. The V-12 program was one that the Navy put together with 131 colleges and universities. And as a result of this program, they produced 60,000 Navy officers in the war. And it was a wonderful thing, because when you'd go in there, you would go in and you would end up with a graduate degree, with a degree, and at the end of the time you'd have a degree. I had a mechanical engineering degree, and you were commissioned an ensign. So I went to school during the war for the most part. By the time we were out in early 1946, I had an occasion to go to on the Atlantic and on the Pacific on some training ships, but I ended up on an LST in Sausalito Bay near San Francisco. We could see Alcatraz from our ship. And this was the time the Navy was ready to mothball the, so we decommissioned the ship in June 1943, and on July 5th, 1943, after 3 years and 3 days in the Navy, I was honorably discharged. Of course, the first thing I wanted to do was find a job. I looked around Chicago, and actually, what fascinated me were tires and cars. So I came to Akron, and I interviewed at Goodyear, Firestone, and B.F. Goodrich. I liked B.F. Goodrich. I liked the people there. And I was living at the YMCA, and I could walk to work. Nobody had a car. So I joined the B.F. Goodrich in September 1946. As a starting engineer, it was pretty much the same all over. It was the same compensation. Graduate engineers started at $225 a month. Big to you. And but to give you an idea, I was dating my wife, my future wife at the time. On Sunday, we could go to the old Yakimedes on Exchange Street and have a full dinner, and the cost, including the tip, was $5 for two of us. So anyway, from that point on, I worked with the company in some of the tire testing, and then I went to Detroit as a field engineer in 1955. I was there for 12 years, came back to Akron as manager of the passenger car original equipment group. That's what I was in all the time. The original equipment, that meant that these were the new tires that went on cars, trucks, and all the rest. So I came back, and after that period of time, I decided I wanted to make some money, so I tried to get into the sales division. And I had a mentor there that was good, and he said, well, I'm going to give you a job. How would you like to be vice president of the Detroit area for the sales and engineering? And I said, that would be wonderful with me. First time I ever knew 3 or 4 months in advance about an advancement in my career. So I had that job from 67 to 73. At that point, I had a wonderful job. It was the best job I ever had. I had a Cadillac for a company card. I had a golf membership. I had memberships to all the clubs. The perks were just wonderful. The only thing bad about that job was once a year you had the contract negotiations with Ford, GM, and Chrysler. And those were bloodlettings, I can tell you. There were 5 companies, B.F. Goodrich, General, U.S. Royal, Firestone, and Goodyear. These were all going for tires on the new cars, and it was pretty miserable. But once you got past that, was all right. Then the final thing that I had, in 1981, I was promoted to vice president of the original equipment marketing for B.F. Goodrich. That was sort of a fancy name for head salesman, so I was responsible for all the new tires that went on new cars, trucks, tractors, everything except airplanes. So this amounted to about 35% of the production of B.F. Goodrich at the time. It was a great job, but I was approaching retirement. So on January 1st, 1987, with just a little over 40 years, I retired at age 62 from B.F. Goodrich. Things were going on about that time. Goodrich was being purchased by a holding company, and shortly after that, the big company bought that. So now I am part of Michelin, and I'm very happy that that's a quality product. And I'm very happy if they're the ones that handle my retirement. So I retired in, and I retired in '87. My wife and I traveled Europe. We traveled all over. On our 40th anniversary, my son gave us a trip all around the world. We actually ended up by going mostly to Japan, China, and Hawaii, and all that. And life was pretty good. We belonged to the country club. I was on the board there. I was on the board of the church. I was chairman of buying a new organ at the Congregational Church 25 years ago. That was another part of my life. Music was always a good part of my life. So things were fine until about 2002, when my wife was diagnosed with fourth stage lung cancer. She never smoked, and she passed away in 2005. We had been married about 57 years, so it was pretty tough. Within a couple of years, I had reconnected, and I found a lady that she and her husband were friends of ours as couples for 25 years. I finally induced her to come to Hudson. She didn't want to come to Hudson. I introduced her to Joe Resnick and Bob Hills and a few people like that. That paved the way. So we were married in 2007, and she's active. I was still active at the church, and today, most of my time, other than in Hudson, I do Meals on Wheels, and I call as having had two open heart operations. I call on all the open heart patients at City Hospital, SUMA, and that takes my time. I ended up as president of that. It's called Mended Hearts. It's a 20,000 member group across the country. I didn't tell you much about V12 because it was a little archaic when you look at it. We used something like this. It was called a slide rule, and at that time, you got to remember, when I was in school, this was 70 years ago. We didn't have a computer. We didn't even have one of these handheld calculator. We didn't have anything. We did everything like that. I don't know how we ever won the war, frankly, based on that. But so anyway, the V12 scholarship was a wonderful thing. The Navy had a program with 131 colleges and universities. It actually saved those universities and colleges from going under. They didn't have any students. It was all girls. The men were in the Army. And so what they did, they had you come in, and a lot of the people that came in were freshmen that had just graduated from college and had qualified academically and physically. And as a result of that, that program produced 60,000 Navy officers, which was a boon for the war. So I went to school during the war, pretty fortunate. By the time we graduated in early 1946, the war was over. We were, I was given, or I had earned a mechanical engineering degree, and I was commissioned an ensign. After a few months on a couple of ships in the Atlantic and one in the Pacific, just on training ships, I ended up in June 1946. We decommissioned the ship, and I was honorably discharged. Well, first thing I wanted to do was find a job, and as I told you, I went to B.F. Goodrich. After all these years, it ended up, now my wife and I are very happy. Our activities consist of just leaving each day. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we go down and work out at SUMA. I know we're the oldest people there. I'm 91, she's 97, and I'm so proud of her to come down there and work out that way. The other thing that, as a side thing, in 1970, when I was back in Akron for a while, I went down and had a promotion, and I thought, oh, I really want to buy a new suit of clothes. I went down, and there was a store where Acme is now. Those were all retail stores. And there was a store there, and it had a very good men's quality store. And I asked the gentleman there, I said, I really want something unusual. He said, Dick, I've got the right thing. This was December of 1970. I have a 100% silk sport coat and some light wool pants, and this would be a tremendous outfit. I didn't know this happened to be George Franchino. And I did not realize at the time that 20 years later, he was going to sponsor me in Rotary. So anyway, I bought that suit of clothes, 100% silk, I never heard of it, and this wool pants. And so as a result, what I want to tell you today is the suit and the coat and the pants I'm wearing are 45 years old, and I bought it from George Franchino. Gives you a little idea of the quality of that place. The quality makes me think of Hudson Rotary. Hudson Rotary has quality. To me, the men and women in Rotary are some of the best in Hudson. So I love to lead the songs here. As long as my arms hang out, it'll be fine. I'm both happy and proud to be part of Hudson Rotary, and that's my story.
Thank you, Dick. Interesting. Whoop. Hey, Dick.
Oh, yeah. I really won't need it a lot. But
I don't need it, Dick, because I've still got my old slide rule at home. So I guess that dates me too. Next week's 3-minute Rotarian is Den Rich, and we'll draw real quick for 2 weeks out. Ugh, I'll put that one back. Ben Rexroad. Will you be here in 2 weeks, Ben? He's gone. Ah. Well, let's pull another one. Craig Tallman, 3-minute Rotarian in 2 weeks. He just walked out. Boy, Jim Hackney, 2 weeks for 3-minute Rotarian.
I won't be here.
Oh, man. Ron Strobel, 2 weeks. You'll be here. Ah, sold. Okay. A few announcements and updates real quick. A reminder, August 20th is the Rotary Club Family Picnic. That will be at Cascade Park, and we'll have a sign-up sheet coming around in another week or so. August meetings. As I think most of you probably know, there's going to be substantial renovation done in this space in August. The August 3rd and 10th meetings, the first 2 meetings in August, will be held in this room. However, the August 17th meeting will not be held. We're going to cancel that meeting and instead substitute the family picnic for that meeting. So there will be no Rotary meeting on August 17th. And I'll send this all out in an email to everybody as well. August 24th and August 31st, the last 2 meetings of that month, we are going to meet at the Rotary Club of Hudson up on Middleton Road. And for Country Club on Middleton Road. It will be a continental breakfast, but we will continue to meet those 2 weeks. July 29th is the End Polio Now Indians game. There is a little flyer. If anybody wants information, I have it for you. You can also get it off of the website. Ron, when's the last opportunity to sign up for that? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think if somebody wants to go even very close to the time, if they just call Stu Buchanan, and all his contact
Right.
information is on that sheet and on the website.
Right.
You still get in.
Okay. It's on the website, like I said, so all of the contact information, telephone number, as well as email address, and sign up is there. It's a very good time, so I encourage everyone who enjoys baseball and wants to support Rotary's effort to end polio now to attend. Like I said, it's a really good time. Joe Zapatowski, you wanted a couple of minutes to talk about the Rotary International concert that's coming up.
Good morning, Rotarians. If you need a copy of this, I've got one. Just grab me and you'll get it. I'm going to pass around this sign-up sheet once again. I'll do this again next week. That'll be the last time I can do this because I've got to get these reservations in this month. And those of you who have already signed up, please take a look at the seating chart with prices now. You may wish to change your seating arrangements. Just to the left of the chart are the sections are marked out with the price. So take a look at that, and the rest of you consider joining us. This is a special concert by the Cleveland Orchestra in honor of Arch Klump, who founded the foundation, the International Foundation. And on top of that, he was an orchestra member with the Cleveland Orchestra, played the flute, as I remember. I was there. Anyway, sign up And check out the seating arrangements if you have already signed up. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Again, this is an event that everyone who enjoys the Cleveland Orchestra, and I quite frankly can't imagine anyone who doesn't, to consider going, consider attending. It will be a wonderful, wonderful event. Bob Crumpf wanted a couple of minutes for Art on the Green. It's part of our one of our annual service events.
Reminder, excuse me, August 27th is Art on the Green, 27th and 28th. I passed the clipboard out last week, and surprisingly, we filled up all the spots but 5. So if you want to work at Art on the Green, you'll have to get a hold of me and I'll put your name down. So rather than pass it around again, I'll just, see me after and I'll sign you up for a slot. So we have 5 slots left and they're going fast. Thanks for all your help. Oh, there was one other thing. I don't know if you noticed when I passed it out last week, I changed the starting time. We usually started at 9 o'clock, and we stood there and watched, just talked, and nobody ever came until about 11 o'clock for getting a hot dog, as you would expect. So I'm starting at 10:30 this time with the first group coming in. So by doing that and extending each group about 15, 20 minutes, we only needed three groups on Saturday instead of 4. So that's probably why everything's filling up quickly. But nobody commented to me about that, so you didn't notice it, but I thought maybe you'd like to know we're starting a little later.
10:30 to what?
Till 1 o'clock.
To 1?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Bob. I've worked at the Art on the Green for a number of years. It really is a good time. You have a lot of fun, so if you haven't done it, I encourage you to give it a shot. It's a great way to meet some fellow Rotarians and spend some time with them and, serve the community. Reminder, the International Convention in 2017 is going to be in Atlanta. There is reduced registration fee in effect right now. I don't know how much longer that will last. You can go to the Rotary International website if you're interested in attending. There is a fairly large contingent from our district, District 6630, that's going, and I believe that they are trying to get a block of rooms. So go on, like I said, the international website if you're interested in attending, and then you can go to the district website as well and let them know so that you can be part of the group. There was going to be a presentation for the foundation this morning. That has been postponed for a couple of weeks to follow their board meeting. One item that I do want to talk to you about real briefly, at the board meeting for the club from last week. We had a presentation of our budget for 2017. And in the discussion of that budget, we had very serious conversation and discussion regarding club dues. And the decision, it was a unanimous decision of the board, is that this is an appropriate time and a necessary time to increase club dues by $25 a quarter. It's not a decision taken lightly, but it is necessary for several reasons. About a year and a half ago, year and a half ago, we incurred a substantial increase from Laurel Lake for the meals, amounted to about $2,000 a year. To this point, the club has absorbed that, but that is a hole that obviously the club can't always forever continue to absorb. In addition, we've taken on some projects, the Rotary Youth Exchange, so projects that are fundamental to our mission as Rotary, in my opinion, that we're undertaking, reinstituting, like the Rotary Youth Exchange. Last year, we were able to balance the budget essentially by 2 things. One was fine day. Not all of the fine days had designated purposes and causes. When a purpose was not designated, that money came back into the general revenue, general fund budget for the club, and helped offset the deficit. Last year, the deficit was about $1,200 to $1,300, and it would have been at least that much, if not more, this year. In addition, Rotabuck generated additional proceeds beyond what we expected, so that helped to bridge the gap. That's not something that we can count on. So at the end of the day, the question was, do we continue to essentially subsidize the shortfall that we are seeing from our reserves, or do we increase dues? And the decision, again, it was a unanimous decision, was to increase dues. Not an easy decision to make, but one that we feel is necessary. We could continue to kick the can down the road, but all we do in that kind of an effort is continue to dig a deeper hole. About 3 years ago, we had a substantial expenditure for audiovisual equipment that came out of the club funds, and we really have never recovered from that. So in my opinion, and in the opinion of the board, this was the right time to undertake this difficult step. We have not increased dues. This is the first dues increase since 2006. So dues have remained constant for 10 years. During that 10-year period, the Consumer Price Index, Ben looked it up for us, and I think it's something on the order of 20% increase in the Consumer Price Index over that 10-year period. We talked about the appropriate level for dues increase, and we believe that at this level, we won't be looking at another dues increase for a substantial period of time. So again, not an easy decision to take, but we feel it is the right one for the club in pursuit of its long-term mission. We don't want to cut back on programs because that gets into the heart of what Rotary is about. So this enables us to continue as a viable, exciting, and vibrant club. And the board and I look for your support and hope that we will have your support as we move forward with this. So I wanted to share that with you. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to talk to you about it at any time. Jim.
For those of us who were contributing the extra 25 a quarter,
Mm-hmm.
or every Rotarian every year,
Mm-hmm.
is that program going to continue?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm going to continue to make the quarterly contribution for every Rotarian every year. I certainly hope that other Rotarians will do so as well, because that's an important vehicle to fund the International Foundation.
How much is the increase?
$25 a month. So it'll go, or a quarter, I'm sorry, a quarter a month, a quarter. So the dues,
150 a quarter.
150 a quarter instead of 125. And this, like I said, this is the first increase in club dues in 10 years. Okay. With that, Roseanne, if you'd like to introduce today's speaker.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dave Gates. He is a volunteer with the Summit County Historical Society, and he's going to talk to us today about early origins of Ohio. Dave.
Please stay here, Claus, because you may change your mind. I was told I had to get a mic. Yep. Yeah, there you go. Is this on?
It is.
Well, good morning. Thank you for inviting me here this morning. I'd like to start by explaining a little bit about what this program is all about. And when we think about history, there's a lot of us who forget that there was a lot of history here in the distant past. And so we're going to go back and we're going to go through several different time periods and kind of briefly go over some of the people that lived here, some of the native peoples that lived here, and what their life was like. And I guarantee you it's a lot different than our life today. First, we're going to start basically in the Ice Age. And that was even before I was born, and I dare say it without trying to make light of Dick's age or anything, that was probably even before he was born. But approximately 1 million years ago to about 15,000 BC is the time period we're talking about. And of course, at that time, the Earth was covered with ice. was the Ice Age, and ice was thick, somewhere between maybe several hundred to 1,000 feet thick in any given spot on the planet. And at that time, as the glaciers started to recede, they started to carve out the actual shape of our country, this area in particular. And if you don't understand how glaciers operate, the easiest way I can describe them is to think of a snowball. Think of a snowball rolling down a hill. And as it's rolling down, the snowball's the glacier, as it rolls down the hill, it picks up twigs and sticks, more snow, other things that are along the way. And so that kind of changes the contour and the layout of the land. Or for a little more precise, I guess, definition of how a glacier works, think of a bulldozer plowing along and moving things out of the way. So the glaciers actually gave us the actual shape and the contour of the land. And to start with, we have to think about how people came into our country. And if you look at the map, you kind of get an idea of what happened. We're looking at a land bridge between Asia and the United States, and this formed, or I should say North America, and this formed with the receding of the glaciers. As the glaciers began to recede, the water actually fell down, it dropped, and it exposed a land bridge in this area, and it allowed people from Siberia to come into Alaska and North America and eventually migrate down into what we now know as Ohio. So there was a lot of changes going on in the contour of the land as this occurred. Now, glaciers have done a lot for the layout and the land of this state in particular. If you look at the red line on here, this is where the glaciers basically stopped moving in Ohio. The area above that was all what we call the glaciated area. That was the area that was really formed heavily by the glaciers. And there's a dotted line, if you can see, right about through southern Summit County, if you look carefully, across the top of the state. And that's the Continental Divide. And basically what you have is an area to the north of that line. If a raindrop falls there, it will fall and go into either the Lake Erie watershed via one of the many rivers, of course, around here, the Cuyahoga River. So that raindrop will follow north into Lake Erie, eventually into the St. Lawrence Seaway, out into the Atlantic Ocean. If it falls south of that dotted line, it will go down south into the Ohio River, eventually the Mississippi, and out into the Gulf of Mexico. So the glaciers actually contoured the land to what we know today. So to talk about the first people that actually lived here, we need to think back to basically the archaic period from about 15,000 to about 1,000 BC. At this time period, early man started to appear in the Ohio Valley, in the Ohio area, and they hunted. They were nomadic people. They did not live in a specific area. They would move around following the animals and gathering a few fruits and nuts as they went. And one of the main animals they trapped and hunted was this little tiny creature here. This is a vertebra, a backbone, from a woolly mammoth. Now, a woolly mammoth is a large, large animal. If you think of a giant elephant, and by the way, elephants, of course, we all know are the largest land animal today, woolly mammoths were about 12 to 15 feet high. They looked like a shaggy beast. And the early hunters would actually go after these creatures with little more than what we would consider small spears. So if any of you have seen the great Taco Bell commercial where it shows Cro-Magnon man underneath the foot of the woolly mammoth before he gets crushed, that's not too far off the reality of things. Early man did not have a lot of tools to work with. Basically, he had flint and stones. And of course, we're all familiar with arrowheads or spear points, which were knapped from flint. And flint was used exclusively for tools early on. And it was something that was very important and obviously found early by early man. Now, flint came in different colors and different shapes. It could be used as a knife. It could be used as a spear point. It depended upon the actual application that the individual needed. As an example, this is an early knife, and it just looks like kind of a flat stone. But there is a little thumb groove on here that actually where someone would hold this and would work to cut with this. And this would have been chipped and formed and knapped to create a knife. You could have also used an early axe, and this would have originally been attached to some type of wood and to create an axe or a tomahawk type of piece. It would have been attached with something called sinew, which is basically from the muscle part or the ligaments of an animal. It would be cut into small pieces, and then it would be used as a rope or a string to tie the, in this case, the axe head onto the handle and hold it in place. As that material dries, it becomes very, very hard. And that creates something that will hold the items to the stick. Now, in this case, most of the early people used something called an addle-addle. How many of you are familiar with that? Good, somebody knows what I'm talking about. Basically, an addle-addle is just a piece so that you can throw a spear more effectively. If you think about it, if I'm hunting a large animal, I'm going to have something that's fairly long that I can throw at the creature in order to try and kill it. And of course, this would have had some type of point on it. It would have not been an arrowhead point. It would have been a smaller point that would have been detachable. And that's one of the things the paleo people did. They created a removable piece on the end so that if I threw this at a mastodon and it glanced off and broke the point, I could still recover the shaft, because actually this was the hardest part for the native people to find, because it was hard to find long, straight pieces that would throw well. And you can imagine how far you could throw this. It was a little tough. But if you used an addle-addle, you could throw it much farther and much easier. Now, this is a small version, but it still would work the same way. It would have used a small piece of bone to hold the spear, and then you would actually take this and hold this up, get it in position, and when you threw it, you would hold on to the addle-addle but release the spear so it would go farther. Sorry, I didn't spear anyone. But you would hang on to the addle-addle. So it was basically a spear launcher, if you will. It made it a lot simpler for someone to get close to a creature, but not so close that they were in as much danger. Now, there were a lot of other things that were done over this time. The paleo people used a lot of different things, and for some reason, there isn't a lot of history about them. The time that the animals started to disappear, the people disappeared. Their food source was gone. And we're not sure exactly why. We know that at certain points, the temperature of the planet started to warm. That may have been something to do with it, but no one's sure. Now we're going to jump ahead just a little bit farther to the mound builder period, which some of you are familiar with. The mound builders basically were from around 1000 BC to 1650 AD. Now we're starting to move into a little more modern times. The mound builders were an interesting group of people because we don't know a whole lot about them. The most prominent thing we know about them were that they built mounds. And the mounds they built, typically in southern Ohio, were used to bury their dead. But inside, they also had other things that they kept in the mounds for religious purposes, tools, art, pottery, different things that gives us sort of a glimpse at what their life was like. Now, the mound builders were one of the first people that actually lived by a specific area. That is, they were not hunter-gatherers. They did not move around. They lived by rivers. They built small cabins, or I shouldn't say cabins, but shelters basically out of reeds and bark. And they actually planted food. They did not just strictly hunt. And they started to do some trading, something that was prior to this time was kind of just something that didn't exist. So the tools remained somewhat the same. This is an axe head from an early mound builder's time period. This also would have had a wooden handle on it. But you can see the shape of it, how over time it has been shaped, and it probably was naturally shaped somewhat close to that when it was selected. The mound builders also used hammers, but not in the traditional sense of which we think of them. They used something called a hammer stone. And typically these were round stones that would fit in the palm of the hand, and they could be used just like a regular hammer. And if you look at this closely, you'll see that there's a large indentation in the center from a lot of wear from being used as a hammer. Now, the many things that all of these early societies needed were not obviously in one location. Flint basically was received from what we call Flint Ridge, which is an area southwest of here, down around Columbus, and it produced some of the finest flint actually in the nation. And so that was used as a trading part with other areas. For example, obsidian. Obsidian is actually a volcanic glass. When the lava is exposed to air, it dries, and some lavas become this dark brown obsidian, and it's basically a glass material. It's very sharp. This one, thank heavens, is not that sharp, or I couldn't be doing this. But this would be used as a knife. It was also prized because of the coloration, and this is just one example of the types of coloration. And that would have come from the desert Southwest, so it had to get here somehow. Mica was another product that was traded for, and some of you may be familiar with older wood stoves that have the little window in them that you could see inside when it was burning. Mica is typically used. This is in very tiny layers, about the thickness of a piece of paper. And it has a very high strength from heat, so it is resistant, but it is still transparent. And this was used basically by the mound builders to decorate clothing and pottery. Something else, and that comes from South Carolina, and something else that was sought after was raw copper, which came out of Michigan. And this was used not only for tools, but for enhancing dressing and clothing and things of that. And last, one of the things that was prized were abalone shells because of their beautiful coloring inside. And the abalone shell, just like most of your pearls or your freshwater clams, the inside of the shell, where the little creature lives, is very, very bright in color because it's polished soft. Because the creature lives inside of it, you wouldn't want to live on something that was rough like that. And over time, colors develop. Originally, these were used way beyond the mound builders' time, but originally these were used to make early buttons. So this was something that was traded for also. So all of these things were being moved in and out of Ohio. Now we're starting to move into a time when there's actually trading going on, and other people are working with other groups of people. So we think about trade, and we talk about isolationism in this country, and it's interesting to note that early on, we were still trading within the country, but from areas that were very far away. The American woodland Indian is probably the most common thought about Native American that most people remember. And interesting thing was that they were only in this country, or in this area, from about 1600 to 1800, which is a relatively short period of time. After the mound builders, there's a lot of question about who actually lived in Ohio. And it wasn't until around 1700s that the American woodland Indian actually re-inhabited the Ohio area. For about 100 to 200 years, it appears as though there weren't very many, if any, people actually living here. There were people that came through, but they did not live within the Ohio area. So, for whatever reason, there was much less treading on the land, and it perhaps came back, shall we say. We talk about the Pilgrims coming to this country and landing at Plymouth Rock and saying that a squirrel could travel all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and never have to get out of a tree. Of course, after that it changed, but the point is, at this time, this country and this area was still very natural and very raw. So it was very open to the aspect of using the minerals and things that were here, naturally here. The woodland Indians traveled from area to area to find food, but they did not travel in the way we think. They had accepted villages that would stay in one area for many, many years. They would send hunting parties out, but they would stay within one area. So they would follow the animals. The interesting things that as trade increased in this country and started to move between different tribes, we had Native Americans finding a way to get from point A to point B. Obviously, first it was walking, then it was canoes, and you could use rivers, but there was only so far you could go on a river. Typically, the Cuyahoga River, it's an interesting river because it starts northeast of here, it goes to the south, then it turns west, it finally goes north. Most rivers go east or south, north or west. So the Cuyahoga is basically a giant U shape. But down around southern Akron, you get into an area where the Cuyahoga comes fairly close to the Tuscarawas River, which is a river that flows south into the Ohio River eventually, and then into the Mississippi. And the Native Americans found that that area in between, which we know as the Portage Path, was a way to go from one river to the next. So a woodland Indian could actually travel from Hudson or the Akron area, partway down the Cuyahoga, get off, take the Portage Path down the Tuscarawas River. They could take the Tuscarawas south all the way into, if they wanted to, all the way into the Atlantic Ocean, or the Gulf of Mexico, I should say. So this was a very important trading line and something that wasn't actually developed until about this time. Now, when we think about the Native American cultures, we think about the male being the person who's doing the hunting, clearing the fields, building the different types of shelters they lived in. But everyone in the society did something that was very important. The women basically took care of the families. They also tended to the crops. The children were taught to watch the crops and prevent birds and other prey from getting to them. And even the elders of the group were very important in educating the children because they taught them how to act and taught them about the history of the tribe. Now, one of the interesting things about the woodland Indians is what they planted. For years, people have speculated how crops were growing. And the woodland Indians did some very interesting things. They planted 3 basic crops that are referred to as the 3 sisters. They would plant corn. As the corn started to grow, they would plant some green beans around the base of the corn, which would provide a natural pole, that is the stalk of the corn, for the beans to grow up. And then they would plant squash or pumpkins around the bottom of that, which would be a ground cover crop, can't talk this morning, so that it could be used to help keep out weeds. So by planting these 3 plants in companion, they actually had a form of farming that is something that is still being looked at today. But the point is, all these people worked together. And they found out very early that they could not only use animal furs, and they used rabbit. Obviously, beaver was prized because of its natural waterproof fur. Raccoon, all of these materials were used, along with deer hides, for skins that could be used for clothing or for other things. And if you were going to work and tan a hide, you had to have some basic tools. And the basic tools they created were essentially from deers and flint. You had scrapers, which is just part of a rib bone from a deer that could be used to help scrape the hide or to remove the fur if you needed to. You had a very simple knife, which would have just been a piece of wood with a flint, looks like an arrowhead, but it's actually a point. And this could be used to cut the fur to the specific, or I should say the skin to the specific shape you wanted. Once you had it cut, if you had a piece of fur like this, you might want to join it with another piece of fur. Well, how do you do that? Simply, you take an awl, which was another rib bone or a bone from the rib cage of a deer, and could be used to make holes so that you could string several pieces of fur together to create actual clothing. Weaving was actually done too on primitive stick looms, something that would have been used basically to create some type of fiber that could be used for clothing or other needs. Another tool that was very important to early Americans was a drill. And the woodland Indians actually improved upon the drill quite a bit. Typically, drills had been something that looked essentially like this little knife. And you would use it into a material to drill a hole into a bone, into a rock, depending upon the thickness or the hardness of it, I should say, or into wood or a shell. And this was fine, but you had to spin it back and forth. It was very tiresome. Well, the woodland Indians came up with a drill that, quite honestly, I think is better than most of the drills we use today. It was a pump drill, and it was used very simply. You would put it on whatever you wanted to drill into, and you would spin it. Once you had it turned like that, you would actually push on the piece of wood, and you can actually see it work. This saved a lot of effort on the part of the individual who was trying to drill a hole, obviously, because they didn't have to spin it with their hand. They just had to push something up and down. But if you look at the work that went into this, there's a shaft, there's a balancing wheel, there's a point, there's actually the cordage, which probably would have been sinew, and then there's a block. It wouldn't be quite as neat as this one is. Could have been a bone, could have been just another stick on there. But the thought and the technology that went into this is quite, I think, impressive. Now, another piece of material that was used a lot was soapstone. Soapstone was very important because it was easy to carve. It could be used to make smoking pipes. It could be used for making small bowls. The interesting thing was when you drilled soapstone, you got a powder, and this powder could easily be colored. So it became the first types of paint. Of course, when we think of Native Americans, we always think of tomahawks, right? Well, you know, Hollywood has made us believe that tomahawks were some really special, fancy-looking tool. They weren't. They were just heavy rocks that were attached with sinew to a shaft or a handle. And over time, they would have been worn down. They probably wouldn't have been this shape to begin with. It would have been just more of a round piece of rock that would have gradually been shaped. And this was used probably more as a tool and less of a weapon. However, you can imagine the contact would have been pretty powerful. But it could be used as a crude axe. It could be used as a hammer. It could be used as anything where you had leverage or weight required. Now,
Excuse me.
Yes.
I have to apologize for the necessity of my visit someone.
That's all right. When we're talking about the woodland Indians, there's several other things that we always have to keep in mind. And number one was how they lived. And there basically are two different types of homes that most of the woodland Indians used. The ones that we think of name-wise are wigwams. And wigwams were basically just small dome-type structures that were usually made from saplings that were tied together to make sort of a half circle. And then they were either covered with skins or bark, depending upon what was available. And this would have been for one family, probably something that was about an 8 to 12 foot diameter, maybe a little bit bigger. But the ones that we always, I think, are most interested in are the longhouses. And the longhouses, quite honestly, were the first apartment buildings. They were sort of a Quonset hut-shaped building. They were at least 100 feet long, and they would house anywhere from 30 to maybe 50 families. And inside the longhouse, you would have individual rooms in which families would live. And they would typically have a fire pit, and then they would have an area that almost looks like, I describe them as catacombs, but it's like rack shelving behind them, and those were actually bunks or places for family members to sleep and to store things. So here's something that's built basically of a structure of wood and then covered with bark. You can imagine the amount of work that would have taken just to build the structure, let alone to strip trees of bark to actually cover it. And these would have individual rooms, like I said, and each room would have a little smoke hole in the top of their section so that they could have their own small area in which they could live. And it truly was an apartment building. Now, when we think of these, we think of the wigwams, we're thinking of Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo as the basic ones that lived in the small wigwams. But in the longhouses, for the most part, we have Wyandot, Ottawa, and some of the Mingo tribes that used the large longhouses. After this period, obviously, settlers started to come. And with the Treaty of Greenville in 1895, a lot of Native Americans were pushed farther west, or quite honestly, forcibly removed. At that time, there was a great exodus in this part of the country. And today, we have approximately 5,000 Native Americans represented in the state of Ohio that represent 95 tribes. However, there are no current tribes existing within Ohio. You have to go farther west into the Plains area to find full tribes. It's also interesting to note that when you think of Indians, you think of teepees. We think of teepees all the time, and teepees were used as a temporary structure for the Native Americans in this area. It wasn't until you got into the Plains that the Native Americans actually lived in teepees. But in this area, it was a temporary shelter that hunting parties would use. So they would take the poles with them and some skins, they would hunt for an animal, and then they would come back. But it was not a permanent home. Now, the other thing most people think about when you think of Native Americans, if I still have it here, is wampum. Does anybody know what wampum actually is? It's very simple. Beads. Beads were very important to Native Americans because they could be used to tell a story, to make a belt, and just the sheer beauty of the bead was something that was very sacred to the Native Americans. And typically, if you had something that was a belt, it would tell a story. If it had predominantly white beads on it, that was a time of peace. If there was a lot of red beads used on the belt, it would be an indication of a time of war. So you can get some feeling of the amount of history and what went on just from something as simple as a belt. It was actually a piece of information that gave the Native Americans about their culture. Well, I'm going to wrap it up because I know we're short on time, and I apologize for running over a little bit. But if there's any questions or anything, possibly I can try to answer. I don't know if I can. Yes?
Where'd the name wigwam?
I'm not sure where the name wigwam came from. I think it might have to do possibly with the fact that the branches, or I should say the saplings, were woven together. But that's my guess. I don't know for sure. I'm not sure. There may be something in the Native American language that represents, but I'm not aware of it offhand. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Were the Native Americans living close to the receding glaciers?
After the receding glaciers, you would have had people come in a little bit after that period, but nobody came through until the land bridge was actually exposed with the receding of the glaciers. So it was after the glaciers had gone through that people basically out of the end of Russia, the northeast corner of Russia, basically would have gone across the land bridge that was there. When the waters receded, or when the oceans went down about 400 feet, you have to imagine what would have happened. If you can think of any waterway that had that less water in it, what would be there. And scientists believe that there was enough of a land bridge, and that's what actually brought people into this continent.
Is there a place where we could see more about the history?
There are a number of places. There's information on different websites as far as a specific section of it you're talking about. I'm sure there are different ones on websites. If you just, Native Americans will probably get you to a lot, and then you be specific from there what you're looking for. The interesting thing is that this area had so many different Native Americans, different tribes. Some areas just had one. We had about 6 or 8 at least. Iroquois were one of the ones. The Wyandots we talked about. The Mingo were some of the other ones that were popular, prominent in the area, I should say. Yes, sir.
Did a specific language evolve during all this time?
No, each
Communications?
communication, there may have been some common words, but there was a lot of separate languages. There were, I'm sure there were Native Americans that went from tribe to tribe because you had interpreters that learned, but there was not a universal language that I am aware of. There were universal words that went from tribe to tribe, but not an overall universal language that I'm aware of. Well, thank you very much.